A group of Australian lawmakers will visit the U.S. later this month to demand an end to Washington's push to get WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange extradited to the country.
I think it's really, really important that we do keep up the pressure on the US government and that we convey to American citizens how strongly Australians feel about this issue. I think everything that we can do can make a change, and it would be remiss of us not to make every effort that we can on Mr Assange's behalf. We understand that he's in really poor health, and I think that's a really acute concern. And I think it is time, as I said earlier, enough is enough, and it's time to bring Julian Assange home to Australia. He should not be extradited to the United States.
Ryan cited surveys saying more than 9 out of 10 Australians think Assange should now come home. The lawmaker added that the Australian government needs to protect its citizen, who is, in her words, responsible only for acts of journalism. And the comments and the travel plan come ahead of a visit by the Australian Premier to the U.S. Assange has been confined in a UK prison since April of 2019 after losing the protection of the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he had taken refuge. He is wanted in the U.S. for espionage after leaking classified documents related to U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq on his whistleblower website. If convicted, he could face up to 175 years in jail. Crossing over to Bristol, joined by Tony Gosling, investigative journalist and a former BBC employee. Thanks so much for being with us. Is this good news? I mean, finally, we're hearing from some lawmakers in Australia that perhaps they can put some pressure on the U.S. government. Your take?
Well, it's a terrible, sad story, this, that's been going on for such a long time, which really now amounts to a torture of somebody who's now in prison, who should be running one of the most important internet newspapers in the world. In fact, he was doing so. And the reason he's been persecuted, in my view, is that the incredibly brilliant job he was doing exposing war crimes. Look, for example, at the Icelandic bankers who were jailed back in 2009, 2010, because of the documents released by Julian. Look at Vault 7, which he used to expose the fact that the National Security Agency in the United States was spying on people in their homes right across the world, particularly in Europe, hacking airliners, tools to hack airliners, tools to hack cars. So this has been an ongoing torture of Julian, really. And of course, at the end of the day, what happens is the Chinese, when they're accused of going after various people who criticize the Chinese Communist Party, chasing them around China, chasing them around the world, they just point to Julian Assange and say, well, look, you started it, and there's nothing really that the Western powers can say. So this has to be dealt with, and Julian has to be released. And it's good to see these Australian MPs from all the major parties in Australia going over to the United States to make this point.
You know, Tony, this is actually quite unbelievable. I mean, we think about how long Julian has been going through this, as you said. I mean, this is torture. It's slow torture. I mean, June 2012 is when he walked into the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And now we're talking about 2023, and we hear that his health is deteriorating, but we don't have the type of reaction, especially from journalists, other journalists, screaming and yelling that there is a major problem with someone who's just exposing the truth, being tortured in the way he has all of these years.
Well, you don't hear The Guardian particularly doing that, because actually Julian is being charged with crimes that were committed by The Guardian. The information handed over to The Guardian by WikiLeaks, which he's being prosecuted for under the Espionage Act, which is almost impossible to defeat in the US courts. that information was actually not redacted, although WikiLeaks said this must be not be published. The Guardian then went on to publish it, not WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks hadn't published it, the Guardian did. So it's hardly surprising that the Guardian doesn't really fight the corner for Assange, because they know, I think, that it's their editors that made the decisions that have led to this prosecution of Julian. And really what we're looking at, Marcia, around the world, I think, is a kind of almost like an arms race in censorship, a kind of censorship race to the bottom, started by the West in its prosecution of Julian. And of course, this affects many other journalists around the world, many particularly in the West. Obviously, they're looking at this and thinking, crikey, well, I've got a really important secret which shows the West is committing war crimes. Say, for example, it could be in Ukraine, it could be in Yemen, somewhere like that. But if I release it, maybe I will become the target of the Central Intelligence Agency, the American prosecutors, Mike Pompeo, as it was at the time, boasting about his prosecution of Assange. And that is one very good way to stop people from even wanting to publish information about war crimes. And of course that just encourages the criminals to take these hideous measures even further. So it's such an important case. Of course, it's one of the most important in history. I don't think there's any doubt about that, because the West is what they're doing is they're accusing many other countries, Russia particularly, China particularly, Iran as well, of forms of censorship, which they themselves are actually the worst in the world at, because these are the biggest war crimes in the world are being committed by the United States, and Julian has exposed them for exactly what they are.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for being with us out of Bristol. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist.